one of the things the existentialists would say is, what's the relationship between mental health and responsibility? And that's a good question, because it also has to do with something like the definition of mental health and responsibility. It's like, if you want your life to be well constituted, let's say, whatever that means, and it doesn't mean being happy. See, the reason it can't mean being happy is there's going to be times in your life where you're going to be called on to act when you're not happy. So, for example, when one of your parents dies, you're going to make a choice. You're not going to be happy. That will not be, well, hopefully you won't be. Otherwise you're tangled in some sort of Freudian nightmare, but let's assume that that's not the case. You're not going to be happy about it. You're going to be hurt, and maybe even partly broken. So what the hell are you supposed to do then? Well, the answer is, you should be more use than trouble under such circumstances. That's a good thing to strive for, you know, because your mother's going to be, if it's your father, your mother's going to be equally distraught, and so are your siblings, and everyone else you care for. Maybe by that time you should be tough enough so that in that situation, you're good for something. Someone has to make the damn funeral arrangements. Someone has to settle out the will. Someone has to make sure the family doesn't degenerate into horrific squabbling, which is something that often happens after the death of a parent. And you're not going to be motivated to do that by happiness. And what if you have a sick child when you're a parent? Maybe it's a chronic illness. You are not going to be happy about that. You know, it'll be a weight that you carry with you all the time. And it's one of those things that seems particularly unjust. It's like, okay, well, you're no longer happy. Well, if being happy is the purpose of life, well, then you're basically, that's pretty much it for you, isn't it? And you know, these catastrophes that I'm speaking of, you can be certain that you're going to be exposed to many of those during your life. You know, it'll be a rare period. I think it's a rare period in anyone's life where one or more of such things isn't going on chronically. If it's not you with some terrible health problem or some other terrible problem, then it's a parent or a sibling or a child, or because, you know, you're connected to other people and they're vulnerable too. So that's the lot of human beings. And so if it's happiness, and this is what Solzhenitsyn said about happiness too, it's said, happiness is a philosophy whose brought to ruin by the first blow of a guard's truncheon. It's like, yeah, that's about as bluntly as you can put it. Dostoevsky's critique basically said, you can't solve the problem of suffering by formalizing a utopia and joining it like a mass animal. You can't do that because you're not that kind of creature. Even if it was possible, you wouldn't accept it. You'd cause trouble because you're interested in trouble. You're probably more interested in trouble than you are in being happy. Kierkegaard says something similar, but in a more what would you say? In a manner that's more constructive in some sense with regards to what you should do with all that insane energy that you're not going to be able to encapsulate inside a utopia. And it has to do with individual responsibility.
I think at least part of it is the complexity of our society. It isn't certain how the future is going to lay itself out, and it isn't certain that what you knew in the past is going to be sufficient for you to move forward into the future. So there's lots of opportunity, but it's very complex. And it's not easy to keep up in our world. You know, like if you look around the world, you might think, well, the happiest people are those where the standard of living is the highest. That's actually not the case.
Right.
And you think, okay, but why wouldn't that be the case? It's like, what do you want? Malaria and death at 40? Obviously not. But then you think, okay, what's the price you pay for a high standard of living? Well, that's easy. You virtually always sacrifice the present for the future. You're always working. I mean, you guys, you're fairly influential and you've got this good thing going, but like, it could crash at a moment's notice. You better keep your eye on it. And every day you're thinking, okay, this has to be done, and this has to be done, and this has to be done. And it pays off. I mean, you have a nice studio and I would presume a reasonably comfortable life, but it's not like you're not running on a treadmill to keep that going. And so that's security and it's health, but it isn't necessarily happiness, and it's certainly not necessarily freedom from anxiety. And I would say most people in the modern world, weirdly enough, have far too much to do. 2 career families and a couple of kids. It's like, man, you're done. That's 60 hours a week of flat out work.
Yeah.
So, and that can be too much. And then I also think, because our society is philosophically unstable, and that's sort of reflected in this polarization, is that people are doubtful about whether their lives have any meaning, for example. Why bother? What's the use of it? Who cares? It's like, what difference is it going to make in a million years, And life is hard, and if you just have a nihilistic viewpoint, then it's easy to be swamped by doubts and existential angst and all of that. And I think that's a mistake, because I think that your life can be very meaningful. It's proportionate to the responsibility that you take on. And you can learn that by watching when you're engaged in the world, and what works to sort of protect you from feelings of isolation and doom. And a lot of the lectures I have on YouTube are about exactly that.
Positive emotion is associated with movement forward. Like, if you're where you want to be and things are going well, then your behavior should be activated so that you go and get things. Now, one of the negative consequences of that is that if you're really in a good mood, really happy, you're going to be impulsive and make mistakes. Because you hear these dough-headed, that's a very minor word, people who are always pushing happiness as the key measure for successful existence. It's so ill-informed that it's embarrassing that even happens. Positive emotion makes people impulsive. Maniacs, for example, which is really, that's mania, right? Bipolar disorder. If you're manic, you're one happy person. Way too happy. Everything is great. Nothing but wonderful things that are beyond your imagination are going to happen to you, and they're going to happen fast. And so you're down to the mall to buy everything you can possibly get your hands on, because you have 100 uses for everything. And then a week later, you crash into your depressive episode and you realize that you're $150,000 in debt and you've alienated everyone that you know. It's like, that's untrammeled positive emotion. So how about a pure index of positive emotion is no way of determining whether or not a system is working properly, even your own system. You need a balance between positive and negative emotions. Plus, positive emotions are absolutely exhausting, because if you're in a manic episode, it's like, it's time to get everything good right now. Fine, but you won't sleep for a week, and then you die because you just burned yourself to a crisp. And so to be overwhelmingly enthusiastic about everything sounds like a real blast, and I've seen full-blown manics and they're having plenty of fun, but it is not a pleasant thing to behold. They're just all over the place, and yeah, it's really not good. It's really not good. You need a balance between these two systems, because the whole world isn't explored territory bursting with nothing but promise. That's not the world. The world is that in a bounded space, a little bit, with an absolute horror show going out around the periphery. And both systems need to be active in order to keep you balanced. People do, unfortunately, sustain damage sometimes to the left prefrontal cortex, responsible for positive emotion, or the right prefrontal cortex, responsible for negative emotion. And if you sustain right hemisphere prefrontal damage, it makes you inappropriately happy and impulsive, and your life just goes, you just spiral downhill, because you make nothing but impulsive decisions. And you know what the real world consequence of that is? You get drunk and be impulsive for one night, you can learn what the bloody consequences of that are. So often people pursue local pleasure because that's the best they can imagine. It's the best they've been taught. They don't see another alternative. So it can be ignorance. It can be they don't want to adopt the responsibility, because part of the problem with working at every level of the hierarchy simultaneously is that it's like dancing to a very complex waltz, let's say. You have to be paying attention to a very large number of things simultaneously and doing things right. It requires responsibility. And so, it's a pain. It's a weight. Part of the reason people drink alcohol is to get rid of their responsibility. I mean, that's, you hear people drink because they have problems. It's like, yeah. No. Some people drink because they're anxious, and alcoholics drink because they're in withdrawal. But young people drink because they're sick and tired of being responsible, because it's annoying. It's like, so I'll drink enough, I won't care about the medium to long-term consequences, because alcohol, that's exactly what alcohol does. It doesn't make you ignorant of the medium to long-term consequences, but it makes you not care about them. And partly it's because it dampens anxiety. So it dampens anxiety, leaves your positive emotion circuits intact, so then you can go out there and do stupid fun things. And that's like, that's a party, really. Let's go do stupid fun things. That's a party. But the medium to long-term consequences are, it's risky. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's risky. So, yeah, they don't know better. That's the answer, I would say.